New York is a place teeming with strange sights and characters where almost nothing feels out of place, even the extraordinary. But sometimes, amidst the crowded streets and looming skyscrapers, an elusive presence lingers just out of sight, something you can't quite catch, only ever glimpsed in your peripheral vision. Anna Hartley, a waitress at a local diner, had been closing up late one night, wiping down tables, picking up dishes, when she felt something, a feeling like the press of a stare, an icy touch at the back of her neck. Reflexively, she glanced over her shoulder, the familiar feeling of being watched when alone. She saw nothing but an empty booth and the reflection of the fluorescent lights in the window. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a slight blur, like a vague outline of a figure hovering near the old broken jukebox in the corner. As soon as she looked directly at it, it vanished. Shrugging it off, Anna went back to work, chalking it up to tiredness after a long shift. But over the next few days, she kept noticing it, always at the edges of her vision, slipping around corners and melting into crowds. She started calling it the other thing, and once she started calling it something, it began to feel almost real. At first, Anna thought she was the only one who saw it. She would mention it in passing to her friends and coworkers, most of whom just shrugged it off. But eventually, others began to see the same thing, if only briefly. A shadow slipping around the corner, a blur across the windows of a subway car, a sense of someone moving beside you when you are walking alone late at night. The other thing became a kind of urban legend, a figure people spoke of with low voices. It was rumored that if you saw it once, you would see it forever. Something that seemed to come to life as more people witnessed the strange phenomenon. Those who saw the other thing often experienced strange coincidences, misplaced objects reappearing in odd places, the feeling of cold fingers grazing their arms, dreams in which they glimpsed half-formed faces just beyond their reach. Nothing particularly malevolent, but nobody could deny the other thing's growing presence in their lives. One person, however, was determined to learn the truth. This was Alex White, an artist who'd made his living capturing New York's grittiest scenes. He'd heard stories of the other thing from his friends, and had even thought he glimpsed it on one occasion, just a flash in the reflective glass of a subway car, the other thing watching him from the corner. But while others were unnerved, Alex was fascinated. The idea of an entity that could only be seen indirectly was both terrifying and beautiful, a challenge to his very perception of reality. One night, Alex set out to find the other thing and prove its existence for good. Armed with his camera and sketchbook, he roamed the city, watching every shadow and every half-glimpsed figure. He spent hours at the forgotten edges of Central Park, in empty subway stations, and alleyways where even New York's light struggled to reach. He soon discovered that the other thing was, in some strange way, drawn to him. He felt its presence more often the more he searched, almost like a chill that brushed against him and lingered. But every time he turned his head, it vanished. After weeks of trying to capture it, he grew frustrated. One night, out of desperation, he decided to try a new approach. Rather than chasing the other thing, he would let it come to him. Sitting on a park bench under the flickering glow of a street lamp, he put away his camera and closed his eyes, opening himself to every other sense. He listened to the wind, felt the pulse of the city around him, and waited. Minutes ticked by, then an hour, then another. He almost gave up, but just when he was about to leave, he felt it. A subtle shift in the air beside him, like the pressure suddenly dropped. Opening his eyes, he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, using only his peripheral vision to catch a faint outline, a tall, thin, lanky figure, almost translucent, hovering just beyond his direct sight. Its face was a blur of shadows, yet he could sense its gaze on him. The figure didn't move or speak, it only stood there waiting. Alex's heartbeat quickened, but he kept his eyes fixed ahead. Slowly, he reached into his bag, pulling out his sketchbook, and began to draw. He sketched its shape, elongated, ephemeral, with contours that seemed to waver like smoke. His hand moved instinctively, capturing details he wasn't even sure he could see. Hours passed, and as dawn began to creep over the horizon, he finally dared to glance down at his drawings. The sketches were unlike anything he'd ever done before. The figures on the page were both human and inhuman, with limbs that seemed too long, arms that dragged on the ground, a jaw that hung too low, and eyes that were hollow and endless. The other thing seemed to stare back at him from the paper, a haunting echo of the presence beside him. From that night on, Marcus felt changed. The other thing was no longer just a fleeting presence. It had settled into his life, woven into the edges of his perception. He saw it more frequently, but now it was almost comforting, like an old friend always waiting just out of reach. He continued to sketch it, capturing different glimpses and angles. In each drawing, the other thing looked slightly different, as though it were evolving, adapting to him. He noticed something peculiar as well. His own reflection started to shift. When he glanced into a mirror window, he would sometimes catch sight of his own face, but slightly distorted, as if he were looking at himself through water. It wasn't long before others started to notice something odd about Alex too. Friends said his eyes looked more hollow, his movements were slower, his voice softer, almost as if it were echoing. He dismissed it at first, but over time, he began to feel his connection to the world slipping. He found himself speaking less, preferring silence and solitude until he rarely left his apartment, surrounded by sketches of the other thing. One night, a friend of his stopped by his apartment who had become worried about him. When she knocked and didn't receive an answer, she hesitantly pushed the door open and found it was unlocked. Alex's place was dimly lit, the walls covered with sketches of the other thing, countless versions, each more haunting than the last. But Alex was nowhere to be found. His phone lay on his desk, next to a single page, a final sketch of himself, his body merged together with the other thing, their figures mended together into a grotesque form. Weeks passed, and rumors began to spread when Alex was unable to be found. People whispered that Alex had become engrossed in his own work and was off somewhere distant, but others said that somehow he was lost in the other thing's strange, liminal world. Sometimes his friends thought they would catch glimpses of him in reflections or shadows, his outline intertwined with the spectral figure. And so the legend of the other thing grew, becoming inseparable from Alex's story. Now, in New York, people sometimes speak of two figures that roam the edges of their vision. One part is the other thing, and the other half of it is a man, sharing its body, merged with the other thing, with hollow, pained eyes, beckoning to be found, and forever just out of sight and residing in the world beyond our periphery.